Good afternoon. This is Leith Morton, Professor Emeritus at the Tokyo Institute of Technology and a visiting researcher at the University of Trier in the research group called DFG Centre for Advanced Studies, FOR 2603 in German, and my German is terrible, DFG-Kolleg Forschungsgruppe, FOR 2603. Under the direction of Professor Heinrich Stahl-Schweitzer. And today I'm going to talk about my book published in the series, which has come out of that research group. It's very bright, isn't it? See if I can adjust it a little. Can you see that? That's the book which has been published in the research group. The title of the book is The Writing of Disaster, Literary Representations of War, Trauma, and Earthquakes in Modern Japan. So I'm going to be reading from the introduction and elaborating a little on what is happening in the book, published earlier this year. Okay, my book consists of some 10 chapters if you include the reflections, although the reflections are not really a chapter. So the first chapter is a study of the Great Tokyo earthquake and literature. That's the earthquake of 1923. The second chapter is a study of tanka, the tanka or short song version genre of Japanese poetry. And I'm looking at those tanka which were published during the Second World War, looking primarily at tanka that expressed some resistance to the war, but also examining some patriotic tanka. Chapter 3 is a study of a 2-volume book written by a captain in an artillery regiment who fought in 1939 at the battle which is known in Japan as Nomonhan between Japan and the Soviet Union, which Japan lost, and in which over 100,000 soldiers on both sides were involved. It was a massive battle, which was hushed up effectively by both countries until recently, until the last 30 or so years. Chapter 4 is a study of war in China and the Pacific, focusing on 2 poets, Takamura Kotaro and Kusano Shinpei. Chapter 5 is a study of self-censorship, detailing how Japanese poetry published during wartime was self-censored by the authors, looking at a number of writers in particular, 4 writers, 4 poets in particular. These are all shi poets, free verse poets. Miyoshi Tatsuji, Tsuboi Shigeji, Kaneko Mitsuharu, and Takahashi Shinkichi. Chapter 6 is a study of Tanizaki Junichiro's great novel, The Makioka Sisters, Sasame Yuki in Japanese, or the literal translation would be soft snow or light snow. Published in 1948, and it's a study of how a number of natural disasters, in particular a massive storm which resulted in a huge flood which engulfed parts of Kobe, made many people homeless, how this appears and is represented in the novel. Chapter 7 is the study of the Okinawan author Oshiro Tatsuhiro and his writings on yuta, who are spirit mediums. Chapter 8 is a study of the 2011 East Japan earthquake, looking primarily at free verse. And chapter 9 is a study of the same earthquake, but looking at traditional genres of poetry. So those are the chapters of my book. Now, in fact, there are very few books in English and also in other European languages, and not that many books in Japanese either, which combine the topics of war and natural disaster. That's why I think this book breaks new ground in its attempt to draw together and analyze as a single phenomenon the literature that arises from these tragedies. There are a number of studies in European languages on war, books that are about war. Two or three at random. You have Maurice Blanchot's 1980 book in French, L'écriture du désastre, translated into English as The Writing of Disaster. Kate McLaughlin's 2011 book called Authoring War, and Christopher Coker's 2014 book Men at War. but Men at War. But there are other books and other languages, but they're not that many. There's also, of course, a considerable body of literature in European languages on the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. This is a very big topic, a separate topic, and I don't treat it in my book because it would deserve another book. However, some of the methodologies that are used by analysts studying the atomic bombing, I do use in my book. Now, of course, I don't look at all the wars and all the major disasters that have occurred in modern Japan over the last 100 years. I don't look at the Russo-Japanese War of 1905-6. I don't look at the literature produced during that war, although there were some important works of fiction and poetry produced. I don't look at the 1995 earthquake in Kobe, which killed over 6,000 people, the third most destructive earthquake in modern Japanese history because of the exigencies of space. I simply don't have enough room in one book to deal with these tragedies. And there are others, I'm sure, that I have overlooked. I draw largely upon Japanese research to analyze these events. And I rely upon editions of poetry and prose published by Japanese presses. I should mention this book has a slight preponderance of chapters on poetry. Of course, there are chapters on fiction as well. And this is very rare. Very, very few books study the poetry produced by the disaster by the literature of disaster. So that's something quite new in my book. The book is a study of literature, although I draw upon historical sources, I draw upon studies of trauma, I draw upon psychological and psychiatric studies. Nonetheless, my sole contribution is to analysing these works as literature. In my introduction, I discuss exactly what literature is and how it's related to the truth of history. It's not the same, of course, as the truth of history. It is, in fact, literature is essentially a description of an imagined reality, which therefore is fictional. I also look at various theorists whose work I've used in an attempt to establish a fairly consistent methodology when reading poetry. I cite, for example, from Peter Verdonk's 2013 work, The Stylistics of Poetry, and also Jonathan Culler's 2015 book, Theory of the Lyric, which I think both books are very useful in describing what poems are and how we should read them. And I also look at some essays by philosophers like John Gibson, who have discussed the relationship between literature and knowledge, literature and reality. So, having given you a broad outline of what my book attempts to do, the chapters in the book, I'll go in a little bit more detail now and talk about those chapters. So now I'll discuss the chapters in some detail. The first chapter is on the 1923 earthquake, in which over 100,000 people died. Certainly in terms of the number of deaths, the most destructive earthquake in Japanese history, recorded history. This is one of the main documentary sources I used in writing that chapter. This is a collection of photocopies and extracts from primary documents, magazines, books and so on, which were published on the earthquake, which is called in Japanese Kanto Dai Shinsei. That's what this says, Kanto Dai Shinsei. And these are some photographs of people fleeing the fires, because the main disaster was the fires that burnt most of Tokyo after the earthquake. So I look at a number of magazines and journals. These are listed here on the earthquake and analyze literature from those disasters. This is a drawing by the great Japanese artist Yumeji Takehisa, which is on the cover of my book, and there are other drawings by him as well. So that's one of the documentary sources of the 1923 earthquake and poetry that arose out of the earthquake. Chapter 2 is about wartime tanka poetry written by soldiers who served in the war. One of the books that I use in analysing this, again, original documents is a collection of poetry published by the Araragi poetry group, which is one of the major poetry circles at the time. This book is called Shina Jihen Kashu, which means poetry collected from the China incident, which was the Japanese name for the invasion of China. And the editors are two very famous poets, Tsuchiya Bunmei and Saito Mokichi. And there are hundreds and hundreds of poems in this book, which is a collection of tanka by various poets belonging to the Araragi group, and that's one of the many books that I use in analysing this source. Chapter 3 is a study of the Nomonhan incident, which was this massive battle that occurred in Mongolia, on the plains of Mongolia, between the Soviet Union and Japan. It's a study of this two-volume novel. Well, it's not really a novel. It's kind of a novel memoir based on the author, who was a captain in an artillery regiment, based on Captain Kusaba Sakai's field diaries. And the illustrations are by himself and also by another artist. This sold 1 million copies during wartime, which is quite incredible for a wartime book. And it's called Norokochi in Japanese. Norokochi, which means the Noro Plains. And on the top, it Nomonhan appears on the top, and you can see in the book there are various photographs which the author took during the course of the battle. You can see there a photograph there are also line drawings, illustrations, for example. A lot of it's about tank battles because the author was in charge of a tank regiment. So that's chapter 3. And just on chapter 3 and Norokochi, Noro Hills, there is no study, to my knowledge, in English or Japanese or any other language discussing these two volumes. Chapter 4 then is a study of two free verse poets, the wartime poetry produced by them. Takumura Kotaro, this is Takumura Kotaro, one of the volumes from his collected works. And this is an English translation of one of his wartime collections. The other poet is Kusano Shinpei. Kusano Shinpei, this is a volume from his collected works, and this is my translation of one of his books. You can see it there. Chapter 5 is a study of self-censorship, looking particularly at two poets, Kaneko Mitsuharu and Takahashi Shinkichi. Chapter 6 is a study of Tanizaki Junshiro's most famous novel, Sasamiyuki. This is the edition of Sasamiyuki, the Makioka sisters, that occurs in his collected works. And it's a study of, as I said, these massive storm that occurred, which caused Kobe to flood. That was in 1938. The next chapter, chapter 7, looks at post-colonial hybridity in the writing of Oshiro Tatsuhiro, who was an Okinawan author, and looks in particular at one story, although I do examine some other volumes by him. Chapter 8 deals with the 2011 earthquake, in particular as recorded in the magazine Gendai Shitecho, Modern or Contemporary Poetry Handbook. This volume, which is 2012, has a special section on the earthquake, as it says here, Ima koko ni shi no koe o Higashi Nippon Daishinsai kara 1 nen. So 1 year after the great earthquake, how are the voices of poets? This is a monthly magazine still produced in Japan, and I study a couple of hundred issues of this magazine to look at how the earthquake is represented in the 3 or 4 years after the event. Also, I use a lot of critical works they're still starting to come out. There's one critical book on the earthquake, the literature represented by the earthquake. Let me emphasize it's about the literature, poetry and prose. That's an essay collection. And I'll show you a book by the great poet Wago Ryoichi. This is his most famous book called Shi no Tsubute, Stone Poems or Pebble Poems, which was one of the most important books published originally in Twitter, but then published about the event. And I discuss him in part with many other modern poets who appeared in the Contemporary Poetry Notebook. This last chapter, chapter 9, also deals with the March 2011 earthquake, but looks at traditional varieties of poetry, genres of poetry like tanka and haiku. This is one of the books that I look at. This is a collection of tanka by Hasegawa Kai, who normally doesn't write tanka, but he wrote this book. It's called Shinsei Kashu, collection of tanka about the earthquake. So these are the chapters of my book. Finally, on the 2011 earthquake, although the last two chapters are all studies of poetry, I also look at one novel, this novel, which hasn't been translated into English. I don't think it's translated into any European language, called Koi Suru Genpatsu, The Nuclear Power Plant in Love, by Takahashi Genichiro, very important contemporary author, and quite a bizarre novel, which I discuss and translate parts of in my book. The overall study relies upon translation. In my reflections, my conclusion at the end of the book, I discuss what translation means, how one translates the literature of trauma, and I discuss the purpose of my book, to communicate the literature, most of which I believe is important and significant literature, some of which is great literature, but some of which is not. I discuss the significance of this literature for people who cannot read Japanese. Obviously, 99% of everything that's written about these immense tragedies, World War II, the earthquakes, flood, and so on, is in Japanese. And unless someone such as myself provides a context, a hermeneutic context, so that these works of literature, these poems, can be understood, and of course provides translations, then there is a very little opportunity for non-Japanese reading authors to understand and comprehend these works. Finally, when I was at Trier University working with the college, we were looking at the shift from print media to cyber media to online representations of poetry and song, although of course many of these poems that appeared in YouTube and so on were eventually printed. In the book, the internet didn't exist until 2011, or until the late 20th century. So most of the poems and prose are not available on the internet. However, Wago is a huge internet figure, and he's available on YouTube as many of the authors of the poetry. On the two, there's a picture of Mr. Wago. He appears quite often on YouTube and the internet, also radio, talking about his poetry. So in this book, I also try to cover some of how there has been that shift. But still, print media is dominant in Japan for poets. They do publish a great deal on the internet, but essentially they rely upon books to circulate amongst readers. And I think print media for the foreseeable future is still going to be an important resource for those of us who are students of poetry. And again, finally, reading this book, it's interesting how relevant, I think, and how important as works of literature these poems and these novels are, because they speak to us directly. And now we are in the midst, as I make this recording, in the midst of a plague, a terrible coronavirus plague. And we can see at this time of crisis how we read. I think people read and watch television and so on. They resort to art and literature as a means of solace, as a means of communicating their feelings, of connecting to other people. And I think my volume hopefully will permit people to connect to the Japanese who lived through these immense tragedies via the poetry that some of their best poets wrote and the prose that some of their best novelists wrote. Thank you very much.